welcome all. I was really honoured and very excited to be asked to talk here today by John and the Riddick team. Innovation and agriculture has always been a big part of my background and now my career. I grew up just west of here on a mixed cereal cropping and livestock farm near Rutherglen, actually, where you'll be going for dinner tomorrow night. That farm's still in my family, even though it's probably fair to say it's a bit of a weekend indulgence for me now rather than a career. Probably a classic Collins Street farmer at the moment. So unless Deloitte open an Albury-Wodonga office, it might stay that way for a while. But I'm now an economist, so I'm in the part of Deloitte called Deloitte Access Economics, and part of my job and our job is to look through the economy and understand what's going on to do things like drive productivity and grow the economy. So the topic here today brings together my background and my career, and the topic is, across the economy, what is happening by way of innovation that might have application to Australian agriculture. So we've been asked by Riddick to support early detection and improved understanding of national issues that will impact Australian agriculture. We've specifically asked to identify and examine innovations from other sectors that could be applied within agriculture that would grow it and do things like lower costs, raise productivity, open up new markets. The project's timely. We heard earlier about some of the opportunities in Australian agriculture and how important it is that we do things right. Part of that will be innovation. Several years ago, Deloitte asked the question, with the mining boom coming off, where in the Australian economy might equivalent opportunities be to support economic growth going forward? We looked at the whole economy on two main scales. So we're talking about this chart here. Every sector of the economy is mapped there. The size of the dot reflects its current size now. On the horizontal scale, each sector's been placed according to how good Australia is at producing output for that particular sector. Things to the right, we're very good at it. We have competitive advantage. Things to the left, we're not so good at it in a global sense. On the vertical, we have the demand side. And Alistair mentioned earlier about how demand for agricultural production globally, it looks good. We're positive. Agriculture is therefore quite high on that scale. But what we look for in areas with growth potential are the sectors that are in this top right quadrant. And you'll see agriculture circled there. It's very much in that sweet spot, perhaps more than any other sector of the economy at the moment. It plays to Australia's advantages and the world will increasingly want it. Now, this isn't a forecast. It's not to say agriculture is going to grow, and certainly if we're talking employment, it probably won't. It's an opportunity to grow, but we have to do a lot of things right, because if we don't, the world's changing. We'll gradually lose competitive advantage and move to the left, because we can't always rely on things like natural resources and proximity to Asia. We have to continue to innovate. I was at a Deloitte conference last week bringing together my colleagues nationally and around the world, and a recurring theme was that the world's changing. The knowledge economy is becoming pervasive. Disruption is inevitable and it's becoming everywhere. In our industry, which is professional services, the message was clear: innovate or be left behind. We don't want to be the next Kodak or the next Blockbuster. The same message could apply to agriculture. We started this job and we cast the net wide. We probably came up with over 100 potential innovations throughout the economy that may have application to ag. We also wanted to demonstrate where ag itself is innovative and where it does things that might have application elsewhere in the economy. Over 100 innovations were selected, gradually whittled down through a process of speaking to subject matter experts. We had a workshop in Canberra with some industry experts in some of the sectors we're looking at. The list of 100 came down to about 30. I'll show you that list shortly, whittled down again to 15, and finally we've settled on 6 innovations out of agriculture that are the focus of this paper you've been given in your material here, and I'll talk a little bit about those 6 later. Probably wondering, well, how did we first of all come up with 100 and then how did we end up with 6? We had a criteria based on 7 main attributes. We were most interested in those innovations that had the biggest potential reach. In other words, these aren't niche areas. We've tried to focus on innovations where the potential reach within agriculture is wide. And we wanted to focus on those with a bigger impact. So those, for those affected, how big would the innovation be? What would be the impact on them? So we're looking, we're really asking, is this thing a game changer or just something nice or handy to have? We wanted to be confident about the impact. There's a lot of blue sky thinking in the space of innovation and what it might do. It's probably fair to say some of those things are kind of left field, and we wouldn't forecast with confidence that in fact they'll happen in the foreseeable future. So we tried to focus on those where it likely is going to happen in the time frame we're thinking here, which is either now happening or in the next decade or so. Recognising that for certain innovations, they may have big impacts, but well beyond that particular period. Hence, we were considering current maturity. We didn't want ones that were mature in ag, but some of the innovations are already being used and applied in small parts of ag, but we see potential to go wider. We wanted different types of innovations, so didn't want them all to be kind of digital technology or all to do with process, organisational or marketing innovations. We wanted to get a list together that had some diversity around the type of innovation. Similarly, diversity was sought in the type of impact. So some innovations enhance productivity, some reduce costs, some open up new markets, produce new products, reduce risks, promote competition, or even reduce environmental impact. The types of impacts innovation can have is quite diverse, and we wanted some of that diversity in our list. So the long list is probably too long, and look, it was repetitive. Sometimes we had the same sort of innovation reflected in different terms. This list, and even in this list here, which is the top 29, there's still a little bit of that. But this is the list we started with. I won't read through it. I'll jump straight to the next slide, which shows in blue those that made our list of 15. And at each stage, each filtering stage, we went into more and more detail on each innovation. So here we have 3D printing, radio frequency ID, GPS trackers, robots and automation, drones, nutritional genomics, membrane filtration, that's an application of nanotechnology, big data analytics, electronically delivered medicine, crowdfunding, microgrids, and wearable devices. In agriculture, some of the innovations we looked at there that we see having potential elsewhere in the economy were farm information platforms, virtual fencing, and regional biomarkers. Probably mention the shared economy there too. I know Uber was mentioned earlier. Yeah, that's one we certainly considered and see potential in ag. Probably might not happen in the short term, and the areas we're probably not as confident about, but you could certainly foresee a time when things like farm machinery and even land could enter the shared economy, and to make sure it is used more efficiently. So then we got to our final list of 6. GPS trackers, robots automation, nutritional genomics, crowdfunding, microgrids, and the ag one we're going to look at is regional biomarkers. So we'll get back to them in a minute. I just want to step back at this stage though and think about what drove these technologies elsewhere in the economy and what will drive their use and application in ag. Competition is a big one. It encourages farmers and businesses outside of agriculture to maximise productivity. It's led to various ag innovations, for example, drip irrigation, reducing water use, dairy mechanisation, reducing labour needs, pest management, increasing yields and reducing costs. Changes in environment, climate change was mentioned earlier, also things like land degradation or biosecurity threats, even extreme events, That can promote the development of innovations that allow agriculture to adapt to these threats. So some examples there might be things like minimum tillage or deep ripping, types of land use management that deal with land degradation problems. There's a changing consumer preferences driver here. As consumers become more discerning and perceptions on things like quality, provenance, health, ethics, it all drives the development of innovations that allow greater transparency and traceability of agricultural products, both on farm and along supply chains. The establishment of RDCs, of course, of which RIDIC is one, also enables effective collaboration between government and industry and assists in setting the direction for investment in the adoption of R&D. An example there may be the role of MLA with the National Livestock ID scheme and the technology behind that. Macroeconomic trends can't be ignored. They too drive innovation out of necessity. We've just come off the mining boom. Obviously, while it was happening, it created a raft of pressures in the agricultural sector, which had to respond. So things like the high dollar driving supply chain efficiencies, or higher labour costs driving capital investments that replaced labour. Turning now to what might continue to drive innovation in the future. While those same drivers just discussed will no doubt continue to operate, there are some new drivers emerging. Digital disruption is a term I'm sure you've heard a lot. Not so long ago, Deloitte looked at digital disruption and we like charts as an economist. Here's another one, mapping all the sectors of the economy according to how exposed they are to being digitally disrupted. Agri is in the top right here. That means long fuse, big bang. That means it's not necessarily the first to be impacted by digital, but when it happens, it will be very important. So it does play to the urgency that John spoke at earlier. Digital technologies have been around for a while. Ag hasn't, looking objectively across the economy, hasn't been the first to jump on board, but it's very important that eventually they do, because if they don't, they'll miss out. I'm conscious here only some of the audience is direct in ag. We've obviously got a lot of people elsewhere in the ag supply chain and in R&D. So if you can't read that, if you can have a look and think about where your sector is and what happens if you don't move into the knowledge economy. A couple of other future drivers, things that are happening right now might be free trade. So we've got expanded market access. Along with that comes emerging competitive pressures, because we're not the only ones signing free trade agreements. And also greater environmental and social pressures. Things like green consumerism are driving innovation in ag. Climate change and extreme weather, the environmental credentials of food, the ethical nature of food production matters more now, and is expected to in the future than it ever has. On to the innovations themselves. The first one here is the one I mentioned earlier, regional biomarkers. Now, unfortunately, I'm only going to scrape the tip of the iceberg here. You do have more information on some of these technologies and innovations in the material provided. Regional biomarkers. So here we're talking understanding the provenance of food, where it was grown, either what region, what country, and perhaps the time it was grown, by looking at the produce at a molecular level. And effectively what you're looking for is like a fingerprint that identifies unique attributes of produce that comes from a certain region. So there's current applications in health, particularly around monitoring, evaluation, optimisation, application of treatments and outcomes. But it's a technology, or it's an innovation where ag is leading, and probably the part of ag that has been leading the most would be the wine industry, where claims of region of origin are quite critical to the perceived quality and the actual quality of the product. We were quite surprised, though, in the workshop we had that, in fact, other parts of ag are using the same sort of technology to give consumers information and confidence that when they're buying food from a particular country or a particular region, that's not a fraudulent claim. So the first of the 6 innovations elsewhere in the economy that are have great potential in ag. Big data analytics, another one that was mentioned earlier. So this is revealing insights from very large and complex data sets that in some way optimise decision making in a way that wouldn't be possible with traditional means of data analysis. So if you like, it's a triumph for faster computers and the ease of collecting data in this day and age. It's come from parts of the economy have been using this for a long time and a lot more than ag is currently. Classic case is retail. So where to put new stores. It requires a whole lot of wealth of spatial data to be considered as to where would the store best go. Once I've got a store, what should I stock in it? What sort of marketing would appeal to the catchment that the customer is likely to come to that store? It's used in finance for things like risk assessments of customers, even determining insurance premiums. And in health, in areas like predicting epidemics or biosecurity modelling, and even treating disease and improving quality of life, all uses big data, and it allows decision makers to make better decisions that otherwise they couldn't be making. In ag, it has great potential. There's already areas where it is getting used to minimise inputs in areas of precision agriculture, which isn't possible unless you've got good data. So that's using data like soils, weather, wind, vegetation, aspect, topography, even the fertiliser history can all be used to optimise how much fertiliser to put at different parts of the land. So you're not either putting too much and being wasteful, but critically you're getting the right amount where it's needed most. Same sort of decision making can apply to a whole lot of other inputs put to land management. Robots and automation, another one that was touched on earlier, and certainly it is already happening, but this is where machines perform repetitive and labour-intensive operations. It has been in other parts of the economy almost a century now, probably since the first assembly line with the Ford. And it's been used heavily in manufacturing since. But now we're seeing a lot of autonomous vehicles, autopilots on planes. Even for householders, we have things like robots to do vacuum cleaning and robotic lawnmowers to mow lawns. It's typically used in areas where it's a controlled environment. So in ag, it's probably more commonly used in horticulture, some of the small scale operations. It's some of the constraints or the difficulties is how getting the robots intelligent enough to deal with unpredictable circumstances. I wouldn't have a lot of confidence at the moment that a robot on my farm would know what to do with all the water hanging around, and I'm pretty sure I know the fate of it. Getting that right and understanding, getting the artificial intelligence right to adapt to these things that are more unpredictable is the frontier we have to overcome before it can be used in more broad acre sort of agriculture. So we are talking things like field robots, harvesting that do activities that otherwise labour would have to do. Harvesting, seeding, weeding, pruning, thinning. Robotic milking in dairy is certainly happening. We have drones now to do surveillance, to do dangerous work that otherwise people would have to do, either dealing with dangerous chemicals or perhaps working in dangerous environments. And we're starting to see it in food processing, particularly around things like livestock slaughtering. It's probably fair to say it's most attractive to those parts of ag that are labour intensive, because the nature of autonomous vehicles and robots is to replace labour. So things like horticulture and dairy are obvious areas of early adoption of this technology. It does touch at a spot though where innovation often gets critiqued, and that's because this sort of technology is unapologetically replacing labour. So even though on that chart earlier we're quite confident that agriculture will grow, we wouldn't say the same thing about employment in agriculture. Things like robots in agriculture will grow employment, it just won't be employment in traditional agriculture. Nutritional genomics. Now, this is one which is probably more longer term, and it's really currently only got application in health in a perverse way. So it's using genomes and nutrition to deliver targeted health outcomes. So linking genetics, nutrition, and health. My wife's a dietitian, so she was very excited to see this on the list. But what it allows in her industry to do is target nutrition and diet specific to the individual and their illness and their composition. So rather than treating everyone the same diet, regardless of what they have, you can really optimise for that individual. So you can think of the obvious potential application there in things like livestock, particularly where we're feeding inputs to those livestock. So instead of just basing it entirely on herd averages, you can really target the exact need of each individual animal. Of course, in health, it's often used to treat things like illness and obesity. In agriculture, it's probably going to be targeting the opposite in things like weight gain and muscle. Microgrids. They've been around for a long time. These are electricity generation off the grid. We've had generators and diesel and even primitive solar and wind operations for some time, but we really are approaching a transitional point in that particular field where the economics of remote power is vastly more attractive than ever has been. It's been used a lot in mining and obviously now a lot in residential areas, but the great potential for ag lies in minimising some of the costs to do things with power outages. It'll allow, it will make agriculture in remote areas which are typically marginal areas, more attractive. So it might open up agriculture in such areas. But it'll have less direct effects too by making things like labour supply more attractive in these remote areas, because otherwise it can be hard sometimes to get a labour supply in very remote areas. So clearly that's one most valuable to those industries that deal in the more remote areas. GPS trackers, very closely related to data, but this is effectively getting devices, chips on a device used to track location of a person, animal or objects. So it's a relatively mature technology. Most of us are probably carrying GPS devices around with our smartphones. It's used a lot in transport, so estimating delivery times, monitoring freight and logistics. Even most of you probably use the apps now around Uber and taxis, so you can observe where the taxi or the vehicle that's accepted you is, so you know exactly how long it'll be. It's used in anti-theft. It's used in the sport industry to optimise athletic performance of athletes. Pet owners track pets, even parents use GPS transponders to track kids. And in areas like environmental management and wildlife, we've been using them to understand better things like migration patterns in wildlife, habitat needs and breeding needs. The potential here is a lot of new vehicles are already GPS enabled. So in the process of moving, you're actually generating some of the data, or you could be, that we'd use in big data. So this highlights a point I'll conclude on, that a lot of these innovations are most powerful and their true potentials are unlocked when other innovations are also adopted. So it's used to drive headers in precision agriculture, auto steering machines. It's not yet widely used in livestock management, but as a cattle farmer, I can just imagine the potential of having a GPS chip effectively on an animal. That animal works through a gate each day. I can weigh that animal. I can get real-time weight gain and performance information about my herd. Sort of information that perhaps was only the domain of studs historically is now increasingly becoming viable for non-stud livestock breeders. Some other very powerful uses and applications: virtual fencing. So that can either be a a passive virtual fence where animals, if they move beyond a certain area, get a signal to step back in within that area. But it can be active virtual fencing, so that fence can move. So it can be a way to herd animals rather than having to physically go out into the field to do it. And clearly in an area of livestock theft, it has great potential. One to go. This is a bit of a different one, not to do with technology, but crowdfunding, crowdsourcing. What we're talking here are community, often web-based funding of projects or ventures. So we're talking small-scale sort of venture capitalists. Charities use it a lot. It's often used to raise money for ethical causes that people support. In food and agriculture, it certainly has potential to encourage food production. We're already seeing examples of it. I'm going to have to look a little bit closer here, but Barnraiser, AgFunder have emerged as crowdfunding platforms specific to agriculture. In livestock, some of you will be aware of a website called Crowd Carnivores, which is effectively people getting together with bespoke requirements of their animals, and that when there is enough demand, that animal or that signal goes to the farmer, the animal's then slaughtered and the people walk away happy with a very customised and bespoke product. Flowhive, another example of crowdsourcing, a new way of extracting honey from beehives. So it's often used for small investments on farm, which may get funding where traditional sources of finance may not be available. And it works because individual investors will all have different objectives, different values, different risk tolerance. So they can find an investment that works for them. It's probably an area that is most likely to assist small or niche type farming, or farming or food production that's a little bit different in some way, that needs to appeal to not the wide scale sort of funding sources, but those that are a little bit more niche. Finally, stepping back from the individual innovations, some of the key sort of insights here. Innovations emerge from a variety of sectors. It's not always the traditional high-tech ones, such as manufacturing and mining, but also areas like creative arts, finance and healthcare. Innovation targets problems. So almost every new product, process and business practice adopted by a business is done to address some problem. Innovations are driven by various factors, with efficiency, competition and the advancement of digital technologies being key enablers. In many cases, the outcome of innovations won't be easily measured in efficiency terms, but they relate to other farm objectives, such as building new markets or improving environmental sustainability. I mentioned this earlier, but it's often a combination of innovations that unlock their full potential. So, for example, the Internet of Things, not to mention the Internet itself, is needed before we can before the potential of big data can be realised. Considering innovations in isolation might grossly understate the benefits possible and fail to identify the biggest bang. We must not forget about barriers. So these things sound great ideas, they're not always adopted in a hurry. So even innovations with clear value proposition to a business or sector might face constraints to uptake and effective use. These are things like the barriers to ag innovation, such as shortages of skills, knowledge, upfront investment capital, or inappropriate regulatory regimes. Thank you for your time today. If some of this is of interest, I'd certainly encourage you to look at the documentation in the pack you've been given, and there's more detail on each of these and the process by which we went through to get to this list in the report itself. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Daniel. That was an interesting, the sort of sky's the limit, and those that work out what you can do with all that and how you can sort of satisfy the needs of your market or your customers or your production needs. Just endless. So any further questions, any clarification? Sean and Sally, have you got any contribution out of that?
Yeah, Daniel, I was interested in your in the breakup of industries and how they sit in terms of digital disruption. Obviously, coming from media, Sean and I are pretty familiar with that. But what are the pros and cons of being in that quadrant, of being in that long fuse, big bang sector?
So, well, the big bang basically means big potential gains. So, if you don't move with the times, your competition will. And so, potential big bang you don't take is, you might end up the way of the Kodaks or the Blockbusters of this world. The long fuse effectively buys you time. You know, other parts of the economy have had to move a lot quicker. But yeah, with ag, and we're certainly talking an industry where ultimately the move to, you know, the knowledge economy and digital will be necessary.
Sean?
Thanks, Dan. That was really interesting. And I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room who was surprised to see your graphic on automation and robots that said that, I think it was 15% of farmers expect driverless tractors and 13% expect drones to be part of the farms of the future. That seems incredibly low for technology that's here right now. So are there lessons for agriculture from other industries that have already got these innovations in how they can speed the take-up, get people interested in parting with their money and getting the benefits?
Yeah, well, in every industry you always get the early adopters, those who just want to be first. Others observe them. If they seem to be doing well, that encourages other adopters. So in ag, it is a low number. We'd expect, if you're thinking long term, that number to be a lot higher. Perhaps it will be when we do get those early adopters in ag. People can look over the farm fence and see, gee, they're doing well. What are they doing? I've got to learn here. And probably the very material we're talking about in this conference, people are getting informed about the potential of these technologies, will certainly help them go away and start applying it in their particular part of agri.
I guess following up from that, Daniel, I was interested in some of the comments you're making about robots, and I guess this touches back on something John mentioned earlier, that for a lot of these transformative technologies, regulation will be a big issue. How big a challenge do you see around things like liability for using, a driverless tractor or drones? Is that going to be something that ag needs to put some focus on?
It has to happen, agree. Whether it's ag's job is another point, but you do need regulatory environment, you need property rights, you need everything. It's not just a case of saying that's a good innovation, let's adopt it. Other things have to happen as well. The classic analogy is the mining boom. Australia wasn't the only country that has minerals in the soil. Other countries tried to innovate, but they didn't necessarily have the rest of the requirements in place, like security of property rights, the right regulatory regimes, and managing things like sovereign risk.
Okay, well, thank you for that. That was really interesting. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Sally. We're going to talk more about this in the groups when you break out shortly.